Introduce the first presenter. Her name is Camille Fléchet, and I think it is a bit different from the talks that we had from yesterday. So she is in charge of dispute settlement. She is the dispute settlement lawyer at WTO regarding phytosanitary issues. She has studied in University Paris 1, Saint-Sorbonne, and University Cologne and King's College. She studied law, and she is working with national disputes, working with advices and settlements. Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to the government of Korea for the invitation to speak at this conference. You said it, it's going to be a bit different from what we've heard so far, and I have to say I feel a bit like an oddity speaking as an international trade lawyer among so many scientists, researchers, and like true experts in the field of AMR. So as you will have heard from my bio, AMR is not my specialty. I work in the World Trade Organization, but the WTO does a lot of work to support countries who are developing policies to fight AMR. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the tools that exist in the WTO on AMR and the work that we do. I want to also do a little disclaimer that my remarks today are here on my own and do not necessarily represent the views of WTO members or the WTO itself. And also to say right from the beginning that the other side of the coin here is that arguably international trade is also part of the problem in AMR, as the increased movement of goods, including agricultural products, enhances issues relating to AMR. But before I talk about the tools that exist in the WTO to help tackle AMR at the global level, I want to say a few words about the institution for those of you who might not be very familiar with it. So it's a relatively recent institution. We're celebrating 30 years, but we have a very broad membership, 166 members covering 98% of world trade. So almost all of the world trade is covered by our membership. And I think the map here speaks for itself. In green, you have all of the countries that are WTO members. So when we talk about international trade, WTO is really at the forefront. Now, what does it do? It negotiates trade rules, more or less successfully. But it also looks at the implementation of existing trade rules and monitors the implementation. And it also deals with settling disputes among states, among members, as they relate to international trade. So what I'm going to do today in this presentation is talk a little bit about those trade rules that help tackle AMR, or that may be relevant to the AMR discussions that we've been having. Now, if we look at the interlinkages between international trade and AMR, there are many. The first thing that comes to mind from a WTO point of view is the access to medicine. And in that space, WTO rules have done a lot of work to provide more equitable access to quality medicines, including antimicrobials. They've done so by reducing tariffs. So now on average, across all types of different economies, tariffs on pharmaceutical products are well below 5%. It's also facilitating access to medicine by allowing certain countries to produce under compulsory licenses, generic medicines for their own domestic production and also for export. WTO trade rules also stand for fostering innovation to develop quality medicines and alternatives to antimicrobials. Another relationship between AMR and trade relates to WTO rules that support policies that are put in place by our members to protect against foodborne risks. And those are the ones that I'm going to focus on today. So just to say here that there are many different agreements, if we look at the set of WTO rules that could be relevant to AMR. But because the linkages are stronger in that space, and also because it's my area of expertise, then I'll talk to the rules on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, the SPS agreement. The scope of the SPS agreement is shown here on the slide. It has, broadly speaking, three main areas of work: food safety, animal health, and plant health. And obviously, AMR is really at the interlinkages between all of them. The types of measures of domestic regulations that may be subject to the WTO agreements are many, and they're varied. So it could be, let's say, a restriction on the use of certain microbials, the ban of the use of certain products, regulations that impose certain thresholds in terms of residue of drugs used in animals before the food products can enter the country. It could be in the form of certification scheme, testing requirements, or safety requirements that could apply to alternatives, alternative feed, as those that we've heard about yesterday. What matters is that the measure is taken to protect against an SPS risk and that it may affect international trade. So at the WTO, we're concerned with those types of policies to the extent that they may affect international trade. Now, one thing that I wanted to show you is this graph, which shows the trade in agricultural products over the years. And to say it very simply, what we can infer from this is that it's on the rise. And with an expanding population, it's going to continue being on the rise. So those domestic policies that may be subject to the WTO agreements, they're not going away. Even they're going to gain in importance in the years to come. Now, what I've said, there is this agreement in the WTO that may apply to domestic regulations that concern AMR. So what does this agreement say? It recognizes first and foremost the space that members have to regulate to protect legitimate interests. So there is a right to regulate to protect human, animal, and plant life or health. But that right has to be put in balance with the need to avoid unnecessary barriers to trade. One way to achieve this is to use international standards. So the presumption here is that if you base your domestic regulation on existing international standards, then that regulation will not create an unnecessary barrier to trade. And that's a very important part of what the WTO rules stand for. They're really there to promote global solutions through the use of international standards. In the SPS space, we recognize the international standards developed by three international standard setting bodies: the World Organization for Animal Health, IPPC, and so the International Plant Protection Convention, and Codex. And all of those three international standard setting bodies do a lot of work in the space of AMR. So those are the international standards that are being promoted in the SPS agreement, embedded in the SPS agreement, and members are encouraged to use them. So what is it exactly that the WTO rules say, specifically with respect, or that may apply for the Codex AMR guidance, is that members, governments, have to base their SPS measures on science. And the first avenue to do that is to base the SPS measures on international standards. So members shall use international standards, including Codex standards, as a basis for their domestic regulation. And if the domestic regulation conforms to those standards, then there is a presumption of consistency with other international trade rules. So that's a big incentive for members to use those international standards where they exist. If they decide to not use those international standards, then members have to conduct their own risk assessment, which is obviously a more cumbersome exercise. But when they do so, they also have to take into account the guidance that may exist in terms of risk assessment techniques, including codex guidance. So there are two avenues to use international standards when governments are developing domestic regulation on AMR. Now, the one thing that I want to strike here is that codex guidance, as other international standards, they're voluntary, right? But because they're embedded in an international trade agreement, they are strengthened because the agreement itself, the SPS agreement that we have at the WTO, it is binding upon members. So the role of the agreements, of those trade rules, is really to provide more strength to the international standards that are developed by Codex, WOA, and IPPC. Now, another thing that WTO trade rules stand for is to support more regulatory cooperation, including on AMR. So even when international standards are not being used, members have an obligation to notify their draft SPS regulation to the extent that it may affect international trade for comments by their trading partners. So it's almost like a consultation process with trading partners around the globe when you're developing regulation domestically that may affect international trade. So with this, it's really to help those who are putting together legislation or regulation on a particular issue, to help them get comments, get questions from their trading partners, and to revise their drafts along those comments. And if we look at notifications on the SPS side, so those are the draft regulations that are being notified every year to the WTO. In recent years, there have been about 2,000 notifications that come in. Looking at the database that we have, only 37 of them specifically refer to AMR. But obviously, there are many regulations that may not specifically refer to AMR that may be relevant in the AMR context. And here on the slide, you have a few examples because I wanted to showcase that those notifications come from all around the world. It's not only a certain members, certain developed countries that are notifying, but we have a lot of notifiers around the world. So recently, Morocco notified a regulation on substances banned from use in livestock. We had a recent notification from Malaysia, which I shared with a colleague from Malaysia yesterday because I was very happy to see a presentation from Malaysia on AMR, and a recent notification from North Macedonia introducing their program on AMR. So if you're interested to see what other countries are doing in terms of regulations that may come into place in the near future, again, it's draft regulations that are being notified. We have a platform where all of that information can be found. It's the EPING, SPS, and TBT platform. Now, how else can the WTO help? We have a dedicated committee dealing with sanitary and phytosanitary issues in the WTO, and it's essentially a forum for members to discuss. So it acts first and foremost as an information sharing hub. And members and observers can share, for example, information about new regulatory efforts on AMR. They can share information about the technical assistance they're providing. There were a few questions in the last session about what does it mean for developing countries. So this is also a platform where members can share what they're doing in terms of sharing different systems, different technologies, and building capacity in developing countries. They can share information on financial support that they're providing to different organizations, including on AMR. And so, for example, this could be a great opportunity for the current government to share information about this conference so that it's essentially a platform to raise awareness, to all regulators around the world about what is happening on AMR today. There is also an agenda item on monitoring the use of international standards. So each international organization is monitoring the use of their own standards, but in the SPS committee, we're also tasked with monitoring the use of Codex guidance, WORA standards, and IPPC standards. So this is where really Codex could come in to explain how their guidance is being used, but also members who think that there is guidance missing and some efforts are needed could bring it to the attention of the committee, or if they're thinking that the guidance is being improperly used by certain members or not used enough, then that would be a good platform to raise that. One last and important thing that we do in the SPS committee is to manage trade tension. So I'm a dispute settlement lawyer, so I love disputes, but not everybody does, and it's certainly the last resort for countries. So in the SPS committee, there is a mechanism that allows a member to raise a concern about a particular regulation that is being put in place by another member. And doing that allows to garner support from other members that may have similar concerns. It's also allowing a member to have a conversation at the multilateral level when it concerns a global issue, right? So in the space of AMR, that would make a lot of sense to have that conversation with the entire membership of the WTO around the table. We do have concern that is currently being discussed on AMR in the WTO. It was raised by Argentina and the US a few years ago, and it's supported by others: Australia, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Japan, Norway, Paraguay, Uruguay. So what's interesting here is that it's supported from countries that reflect diverse economies, diverse types of economies, and from different parts of the world. So it's really they're raising together a concern and sharing issues that they have with one domestic regulation. So in this case, it concerns the EU review of its legislation on veterinary medicinal products, which has a number of implementing acts that have just come into force. So it's a very current discussion, even though the regulation itself dates back to 2019. And those who are raising the concern are essentially asking the EU to consider a number of things. First of all, to adopt an approach that might be more flexible, to recognize that diseases do not affect countries in the same way all around the globe, and that while certain drugs may not be needed in the EU, they might actually be needed elsewhere to tackle important diseases. They're also asking the EU to really consult on those regulations, to consider adopting international standards rather than do something that they consider is more burdensome or more restrictive than those international standards. And they're asking for a longer transition period. So looking at the regulation, obviously, if you're thinking about animals that have been treated before the regulation came into force, like how does that affect the products that are then exported after the regulation comes into force? So we expect that this again will be discussed at our next committee meeting, and certainly not going away from the agenda. So that's a current discussion that is very relevant to the topic we've been discussing in those past 2 days. Apart from the work that we do in the SPS committee, the WTO is also coordinating efforts with other key actors. It was part of the ad hoc interagency coordination group on AMR that had emerged from the first UN high-level meeting on AMR. And so obviously we will be following what will be happening this week at the second such meeting on AMR. And we're also providing input on other agreements that are being drafted by other organizations. And I wanted here to point out the WHO draft pandemic agreement, because a lot, like some presenters mentioned the fact that, you know, AMR is a silent pandemic. And yes, it's true, and it's being recognized as such in the efforts that are out there to draft a new agreement to increase the preparedness and response to new pandemics. So if there was one thing that I wanted to really say as part of this presentation, which again, I realize is a bit of an odd topic compared to what was discussed in the remaining parts of the sessions, is that there are WTO rules that matter for AMR, and they provide tools in the fight against AMR to, first of all, rules that strengthen international standards that exist, including the Codex guidance that is at the very heart of this conference. There are rules that foster transparency for more regulatory cooperation on AMR. We have a system to help countries deal with AMR-related trade frictions, and we have discussions that are happening right now at the WTO on the topic. And you have really the possibility, or governments really have the possibility to use the WTO as an information sharing hub on AMR. So I would really encourage governments to use that platform to be able to share information, including on this conference. So thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions you may have afterwards.